To this edition of UCL Mind's Lunch Hour Lecture. My name's David Williams. I'm Professor of Obstetric Medicine here at UCL and the Hospital UCLH. And I specialize in medical problems in pregnancy, looking after the mother's health. And it gives me really great pleasure today to introduce my colleague and friend for over 20 years, 25 years, Professor Eric Junio, who specializes in particular fetal medicine, but also the well-being of mothers in pregnancy. And his research has evolved over the years to investigate the role of the placenta in fueling fetal growth and development. And he's done some remarkable research in his time, getting into that interface between the mother's womb and the lining of the placenta. He's published widely, written many papers and books, and it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Eric to speak to the title, Disorders of Human Reproduction in the Anthropocene. Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for this very nice introduction, and thank you very much to Sana and Sandy for organizing this. I wish we could be live, but obviously we are live virtually, but not face to face. And so here we are. So it's always a great honor to give the lunch hour lecture. This is only my second one in 25 years at UCL. And this one, as you can imagine, has been postponed a few times. Because of the pandemic, but finally I decided not to postpone it again. I was hoping to do it live, of course, and so today is the day, and didn't realize until recently that actually it's also an important day for the amateurs of Star Wars. This is May the Force be with you, and I hope I will not be shooting at the stars when I show you some of my slides. But anyway, there is a lot to discuss about the context of disorders of human reproduction in the Anthropocene. Now, as usual, we try to avoid any conflict of interest. I mean, I have to say that I have two sons, Olivier and Benoit, and that Olivier made this remarkable poster here, which is also on the UCL website, and which we're hoping to use in an exhibition which has been also postponed due to the pandemic. And I've been the lead developer or the advisor to a different organization from the Royal College to NHS England, through the late Public Health England. And I'm also the co-founder of the Sonic Boom project with Julian Henriquez and Aude Thibault de Mézières. I'm just mentioning this because you're going to hear a lot about this in my presentation. Right, so what is the Anthropocene? I mean, obviously, it was an intriguing term, I'm sure, for a lot of you. So if you Google it, you're going to find 5,000 hits. And I took the top one, which is from National Geographic. And it's an official unit of geological time used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history. Basically, when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet, climate, and the ecosystem. So what's the link? Yes, of course, we are living through a new era of human development. And as far as human reproduction is concerned, I've divided this in two main eras. The first one starting 200 years ago, which is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we started having more air pollution, water pollution, noise and light pollution. And to which you have to add the last 100 years when more people started to smoke, use drugs, medication, and having a much more hypercaloric diet. And at the end, I will talk a little bit about cesarean section and the impact it can have on the long term of human reproduction. Of course, this didn't start 200 years ago. You know, there is evidence of people abusing substances like alcohol more than 200 years ago. This is the famous drawing by William Hogarth of Gin Lane. But what is important is that we're almost living in the same planet at that time, but now there is certainly a global inequality in terms of wealth distribution, but also in hunger and into the distribution of pollution. And if you look at these maps, they overlap in a significant way. And you will see that the map of maternal mortality is almost identical to these two maps. The interesting concept that I came across when preparing this lecture is the fetal matrix, and I decided to use it to describe what happens to the fetus in utero in the Anthropocene. And this term was defined by Peter Gluckman and Mark Henson, who I had the pleasure to work with at UCL when I started at UCL. And basically what we're going to do is to look at the impact of environment and individual human behavior on this fetal matrix, which is the environment where the fetus grows. The book that I just showed you, which is really an interesting book to read if you want to know more about the fetal matrix, derives from the Barker hypothesis. And David Barker was a physician epidemiologist who came up with this developmental origin of adult disease, the Barker hypothesis, and basically showing that adverse environment in the womb and during infancy might be linked to the risk of chronic disease in later life. And I think this is now well established. It's more than a hypothesis, it's a more established concept. And it started with this paper in the BMJ, where they had access to a group of very rigorous midwives in Lancaster, in Preston, who were weighing placenta to the gram in the 1930s and early 40s. And they then, Barker and his team, measured the blood pressure of these people born during that time at the age between 46 and 54. And what they realized is that the mean systolic blood pressure increased by about 15 millimeter of mercury as the placental weight increased from 450 grams to 680 grams. By contrast, it fell by about 11 millimeter of mercury as the birth weight increased from 2.5 kilo to 3.5 kilos. So basically, small babies with big placenta seem to be at much higher risk of developing high blood pressure in later life. Now, what does the environment does to this fetal matrix? And certainly over the last 200 years, as I showed you initially, there's been an increase in air pollution, and there is mounting evidence that this air pollution is associated with an increased risk of preterm labor. Of course, we also have water pollution, which I will show you a slide in a minute, and then you have noise and light pollution, which indirectly may be linked also to an increase in preterm labor through maternal stress, anxiety, mental illness. But what is important in this connection between air pollution and preterm labor is the fact that very recently in Nature, this paper by Bove et al. Was published showing the presence of black carbon inside the placental tissue. And that is really a revolution in understanding how pollution can affect, the fetal matrix and fetal life in utero. There are also an increasing number of studies showing an association with miscarriages, subfertility, and hypothyroidism, so the thyroid not functioning as it should in children. Obviously, there's a lot of confounding factors in those, but I think that the presence of black carbon inside the placenta is quite convincing that there's a direct effect of this black carbon, which comes directly from carrier emission or other source of pollution into the placenta. Water pollution obviously has existed probably for an even longer time than car pollution. And one of the most tragic example is that of the Minamata factory, the Chiesa factory in Minamata, which was pouring water contaminated with mercury into the harbor of that little town. And of course, in Japan, the main diet is based on fish. And this is the result of what happened with exposure of fish contaminated with high doses of mercury in utero. The strange thing, and I can say the shocking thing, is that this association between mercury and fetal malformation was discovered in 1956. This is when the whole scandal broke out. It's only in 1968 that the Japanese government decided to close that factory. Now, we also had the plastic, and This is becoming, of course, an important topic of conversation. You may have seen the Seaspiracy documentary, Netflix documentary. But what I'm much more concerned with when it comes to human reproduction is the microplastic, because in another recent paper, you have here the first evidence of the presence of microplastic inside the human placenta. And this was published only a couple of months ago. So again, this is quite intriguing evidence that, our change that we induce in the environment are having a direct effect on the most important organ, which is obviously the one that transfers all the goods and nutrients and produce all the protein that are essential to the fetal development. Now, because this is a lunch hour lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about food. And, we have, it goes and comes back. I remember a patient asking this question 20 years ago, and then it disappeared for a while, but now it's again on the agenda, and you will find a lot of information on the internet. Why eat my placenta? I suspect that there might be a link with the Kardashian business empire, and then you can find all sorts of cooking recipes. Now, think about it twice. So I've just told you that the placenta was accumulating things like black carbon, microplastic, and of course, there's a lot of cadmium if you are exposed to cigarette smoke. Do you really want to eat that? I mean, do you really want to eat this, organ that accumulates, filters all the good stuff, but also all the rubbish that comes, through our circulation? I don't know. But another very common question that is still, the number one question asked by parents to be during pregnancy is, can I eat sushi? So we're staying into the food environment. And of course, you can eat sushi because it's the quality of the sushi that matters rather than, the composition of the sushi. But another intriguing question, and it probably comes second in all the questions that have been asked on a daily basis, is, can my fetus hear my voice and my partner's voice inside the womb? And this question in particular was asked by one of my patients on behalf of her husband, who was really concerned about going to a concert at the O2, a rock concert where there was going to be high decibel. And that's what triggered our interest in research in the effect of sound on the fetus in utero. And we know about, it's more than sound, is noise pollution. And there's also this intriguing little device that is supposed to transform your fetus into a little Mozart by exposing it to nice music in utero. So it's moved from having, an MP3 on your belly to an internal little speaker here. I mean, to me, it never made any sense because this is a closed cavity and there is no propagation of music there, but simply of noise. But it triggered the Sonic Womb project. So Julian, Aude, and myself started this project almost a decade ago. We've been joined by Anna David, who's given us a lot of support. And Pierre Gela is now the lead investigator on this project. When we started trying to understand a little bit more about fetal exposure to noise and sound, we realized very quickly that hearing is the only sense that is stimulated continuously inside the womb by both environment sound and internal maternal sound, mainly the maternal voice. You have here the fetal sound channels, the channel 1, which we described as the stomach noise and the heartbeat, which crosses through the amniotic cavity. Then you have the external sound, which are filtered obviously through the abdominal wall of the mother. And then you have the mother herself, which is transmitted essentially along the spine, plus of course her voice may be reverberated and comes as an external sound. But what is really important is that there's an abundant, very high quality literature in some of the top medical and scientific journals on the fact that sound actually modulates the fetal brain development in utero and could be a part in language acquisition after delivery. It's obviously not possible to do this kind of experiment on human, but we did evaluate the fetal exposure to external loud noises using a sheep model. And what we found was quite intriguing, because we found that it depends, of course, on the frequency of the sound, and anything above 10 kilohertz will be transmitted to the amniotic sac. But we also found that some frequencies are only attenuated by as little as 3 decibel. And previous studies on sheep and goat had shown that it might be 25 decibel. But using modern technology, we found that actually there is very little attenuation. So that obviously raised the question about protecting the fetus from loud noises in utero. By law, a factory has to provide the workers with ear protection when the average noise increases to 85 decibel. But you have environment where it's over 100 and 110 decibel, like in some part of the underground, for example. And how do we protect the fetus? So Pierre is continuing his research at the UCL Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering, and I'm sure that one day he will present one of these lectures with the result of this fascinating project using phantom model. The ultimate aim, of course, is not only to protect the fetus in utero, but to also protect the premature newborn, who is going to miss sometimes months of its neurological development exposure to natural sound, and to recreate a more natural environment in the incubator. I mean, you may not know this, but as soon as you switch on the incubator, all the equipment that's necessary, of course, to keep this newborn alive, it goes from 53 decibel to 68 decibel, the limit in most neonatal units being 55 decibel. There's certainly something that we can do by better understanding the transfer of noise into the womb and recreate a sort of womb environment for the premature baby. It's also been more than just science and hard work. We also had a little bit of fun and opportunities for public engagement. This is the SWARP, which is basically an egg that was designed at Goldsmiths College, and which we presented at the Brain Forum in 2016, and basically gave you the environment, the sonic environment of what a fetus might hear in utero. We are continuing to develop this SWEG, but it has been delayed, unfortunately, by the pandemic. We got a lot of interesting comment on our blog, and we have got 120 participants to the Brain Forum in Lausanne using the SWEG during the 2 days we were there, and then we're hoping to develop, a much larger exhibition. And so, if anyone has any idea of how we can get more funding for this, we are definitely open to collaboration with anyone who might be interested in developing this project. Right, let's continue with the second phase of human exposure to a new environment, which is obviously what happened in the last 100 years. More mothers are smoking, more people are using drugs, and mothers as well. Hypercaloric diet are a result of our new access to fast food, and then of course we have design section. I'm not sure that it's the same impact, as you will see, but there is also no doubt, and again there is a lot of evidence for this, that tobacco smoke and drug use are a main factor in the risk of preterm labor and birth. They also affect directly the fetal development, responsible for fetal growth restriction in utero. We have shown a long time ago now, when I was still a PhD student, that trophoblastic necrosis, which is basically the layer that covers the placental villi, which are the essential organ inside the placenta, show evidence of necrosis from 9 weeks of gestation in mothers who smoke. And then, of course, we will never forget the thalidomide and the effect of other drugs like this anti-epileptic drug, or the vitamin A, which is used against acne. And then, of course, you have cocaine and crack, which have major impact on the fetal organ development, and in particular, also on the limbs development. I still have patients asking me if it's all right to take cocaine or crack during pregnancy. You'd be surprised. No, the tobacco and alcohol, which obviously are the most commonly used substances in our daily life. As I said, there is absolutely no doubt that it's the main cause of premature delivery. It's also potentially a cause of miscarriages and stillbirth. It has also been associated with the development of fetal anomalies such as cleft lip. Alcohol in large amount is also associated with the fetal alcohol syndrome. There's discrepancy when you read the medical press and the general press, because you have about 22,000 hits in PubMed showing the effect of smoking during pregnancy, and only about 4,000 for alcohol abuse in pregnancy, but you rarely see anything against smoking and pregnancy in the general press, while any even small article unpublished with no control group that ends up, in a preprint in somewhere in the internet will immediately raise the attention of the press, while none of the, smoking and pregnancy articles achieve the same impact. I wonder why. Another issue, which is obviously a modern one, is maternal obesity. We know have about 67% of American and English women who are overweight with a BMI over 25 or obese with a BMI over 30, which is not a new way of evaluating people's weight. It's a problem that affects the whole of the world, but more specifically some countries in North America, in the Middle East, and it's starting to happen, in Australia, in most European countries. It's a heavy burden, not only on the patient herself, but also on the healthcare services, because it now costs more than smoking in the USA. So what's the impact of this on the fetal matrix? And this is where this shows the transgeneration epigenetic effects come into the equation. Maternal obesity is known to increase the risk of miscarriages, neurotube defect, essentially through gestational diabetes, which also increase the risk of having a macrosomic baby, which is a baby that's over 4 kilos or 10 pounds in general. And this is also associated with more hypertension and preeclampsia, and the higher risk for the newborn to end up with a gut necrosis and necroenterocolitis of the gut system, which is obviously extremely dramatic, and general sepsis. And simply a high maternal BMI has been associated with an activation of all the different placental inflammatory pathway, which is probably also what happens when you get black carbon particle in the placenta. So you dysregulate completely the redox balance, the way oxygen is being metabolized, and the release of free radical inside the placental tissue. And that leads to a dysfunction of the mitochondria, which is a little engine that you find in every cell, and which is absolutely essential, and which is being transmitted through the mother line, and which mutates about once every 3,000 years. But I'm not sure that what we are exposing the fetus to and its placenta will not make these mutations much more common now. We also know from mounting evidence that children from obese mothers have a lower microbiome biodiversity. So think about the Amazon forest. When we damage, some layers, you have an impact on all the different layers. And instead of having 1,000 different type of bacteria, viruses, parasites, and other particles that normally exist in our digestive tube, and which are essential for our immune system, the children from these obese mothers, who tend to have themselves less than 100 different species inside their gut, are being born with less than 100 species, and at much higher risk of childhood obesity and diabetes. So if you want to know more about this, I think that you should have a look at this interesting paper, which summarizes the effect of epigenetic inheritance. And you see immediately that diet, stress, exposure to toxins, metal, solvents, air pollutant, here we come back with the black carbon and the particulate matter, dioxins and other chemicals, mercury, can have an impact on both the sperm and the oocyte, and thus have an impact on the development of the fetus. Right, so now we've looked at the fetal matrix. Let's have a quick look at the maternal matrix, obviously the uterus, and what we're doing to this uterus by doing caesarean section. It's now become the #1 major surgical procedure. Out of about 141 million births in the world in 2015, there were 29 million caesarean section. That's around 21%. In the US, where you have an incidence of caesarean section of 33%, you have 1 million caesarean section. And here in the UK, you have 180,000 caesarean section every year. I mean, this obviously always generates an impact in the media. I'm not sure they got it right here, because here you see Posh Spice having her door open for her, but the too posh to push actually should be referring to the fact that she opted to have a caesarean section in her first pregnancy and had another 3 since. And a lot of stars around the world have opted for the same procedure. Now, don't take me wrong. Of course, caesarean section has changed the obstetric world. It has decreased, together with transfusion, antibiotic, and modern anesthesiology method, the maternal mortality rate enormously. You see that the introduction of this new technique in the access to transfusion, antibiotics, and caesarean section by competent surgeon in the mid of the 40s has really decreased the maternal mortality rate. So from around 800-900 per 100,000 live births, now we're talking about 4 or 3 in some countries. Unfortunately, as you see in some developing countries, it's still at the level it was in our part of the world in Victorian times. And again, this procedure is essential. You can evaluate that out of the 180,000 caesarean sections that are being done every year in the UK, at least 100,000 actually saving mothers and babies' lives every year. But then what happens is that the caesarean section rate has doubled in the last 15 years. It's now 21%, and it continues to increase by 4% every year. And there are about 6.2 million unnecessary caesarean section every year. And most of them, 50% of them, at least half, as you can see, are done in China and Brazil together. Countries who are quickly catching up, Egypt, for example, Turkey, Mexico is going into the 50s as well, where half of the women, in Brazil we've known for a long time, half the women actually being delivered by caesarean section. And this is rather strange, because you see the same continent as Egypt, you have the Maasai here, which have a caesarean section rate, and these are necessary caesarean section rate. This is not limited to access, of less than 5%. But if you look at our population, and it's the same in big cities in Africa, the rate of caesarean section is now 21% plus. This is the map I was referring to, which you could actually overlap significantly with the one on air pollution and access to wealth and starvation. And you see that it now almost is overlap, apart from North America, with access to caesarean section. So there's no doubt that in countries where you have rates of less than 5 to 10%, it's because most of the women don't have access to a caesarean section. While those who have rates over 20% is because there is a high demand for non-medical caesarean section. When the WHO recommended 20 years ago never to go above 10 to 15%, it was obviously unrealistic, and rates around 15 to 20% have to take into account maternal age, as I said, maternal BMI changes, but also the influence of the media. And this is a fact of the modern world. And so 20% is probably the ideal rate for caesarean section. Now, a lot of this obviously is doom and gloom. But I want to reassure mothers who decide that it's the best option for them to have a cesarean section, that the complication rate is actually very low. When you think about the complication after the operation itself, the immediate post-operative complication, you see here that probably the highest risk is for postpartum hemorrhage, but it is very similar to the one that you're going to find for vaginal birth after one cesarean section, of course. And this may also be linked to the fact that emergency cesarean section are at much higher risk than elective cesarean section for various complications, but these complications have now become very rare. Infection is well controlled by antibiotics. Surgeons are usually better trained than they were 100 years ago, and the complications, this type of complication, anesthesia is extremely performant now and safe, have become extremely rare. But what about the long-term complication? If we're increasing the number of cesarean section, and now we have in some countries more than 50% of deliveries by cesarean section, what will happen to these mothers? Because countries like Turkey and Egypt have a very high fertility rate compared to countries like the US or most European countries, where the fertility rate is around 2, less than 2. In those countries, you have fertility rate that above 3 or 4. And so that means that many mothers will end up having 4, 5, 6, 7 cesarean section. So after one cesarean section, like for any other operation, you will end up with adhesion in your pelvis in 70% of the cases. You may also, by damaging the womb, end up with 40–70% defect of the womb. And all these placenta-related complications, which are in some ways linked to these scar defects, miscarriages, stillbirths, placenta previa, accreta, of course, they're not very common, and that's because, again, in our part of the world, the fertility rates are low. But it's something that we need to discuss when patients are asking us for repeat cesarean sections for no medical reason. And then there is mounting evidence again that cesarean section may affect as well the newborn microbiome, like maternal obesity does. So what happens when you do a cesarean section? When you create a scar, and the scar does not heal by regenerating muscular fibers. You end up with a mixture of collagen, myofibers, which are the essential muscular fibers of the uterus, which are in complete disarray, tissue edema, inflammation, elastosis. So this scar is thinner than the normal muscle, less elastic, much more prone to injury. It will be responsible for some development of a scar defect, and possibly in next delivery, if there is an attempt to do a vaginal birth in a uterine rupture. Although again, this is a very low risk. It is due to the fact that the scar tissue is thinner and contains, very few myofibers and that are in good condition. And the lower segment of the uterus is quite prone to these scar defects because it contains less muscular fibers. Actually, the number of muscular fibers decrease as you get into the cervix, and then you have more elastic fiber because this part of the uterus has to expand first in the third trimester to accommodate the growing fetus and the presentation, and then of course during the labor to enable the fetus to come through the cervix. So this is a very fragile area. And these are a few examples of, I take all the responsibility here, but these were cesarean sections that were done for a medical reason. 5 years after the first cesarean section, you see here a small defect. This is the uterus, this is the cervix. And this is another view, the first cesarean section done as an emergency, which we tend to do a little bit lower because of the effacement of the lower segment. And this is the second one, which was an elective C-section, 7 years after for this one. And this is 16 years after. That's one of the first C-section I did that I've been following since then, that I did at UCH. And you see here the scar tissue is still visible 16 years after the birth of her second child. So what about the caesarean scar defect? I said earlier that you risk having one of these large defects, which we call a niche, and they can really be as large as the rest of the uterus, as you can see in this picture from my colleague, Professor Jurkovic, that 40 to 70%, depending on the number of C-sections that you've had before, can develop this kind of niche. So not surprisingly, there's also a risk that the next pregnancy will implant inside that defect, and the risk is 1 in 2,000. And then about half of these pregnancies will develop into a placenta accreta, which means that basically the placenta is so embedded inside the scar tissue that part of it becomes impossible to detach at delivery. And you can imagine the consequences with this kind of vascular dilatation of trying to remove that bit of the placenta that's stuck inside the uterine wall. And there is a direct link between the number of caesarean sections that we have been performing and the prevalence of this placenta accreta syndrome. You see that, since the 1980s, when we were doing less than 10 caesarean sections in most European countries, in the UK in particular, the rate of placenta accreta was about 1 in 5 to 10,000. And now it's around 1 in 1,000. And now we are performing nearly 30% of caesarean section. What about countries like Turkey and Egypt, where they're quickly reaching 60% of their deliveries? It has become a real epidemic of placenta accreta spectrum. So the odd ratio of having a placenta accreta after you've had 1 caesarean section is about 3. Depends obviously on the quality of the diagnosis of the condition during pregnancy and at delivery, but these are earlier data from the US, and you see that it obviously increases with the number of previous caesarean section, typically like the rate of the caesarean section defects. So that shows you the connection between damaging the uterus and having this type of very complex placental problem. And the reason for that is that this defect probably because it interferes with the whole endometrial cavity flow, or it interferes with the normal signaling between the blastocyst and the uterine cavity, or the lack of decidua. In about, 2 of the cases, you increase the odds ratio by about 2 of women who've had 1 caesarean section, you will end up with a placenta previa there. And of course, if you're very unlucky, it will also develop into a placenta accreta. So it seems to be directly linked in terms of pathophysiology as well to the development of these scars due to caesarean section. And this is an interesting paper because we know 10 years down the line, it was published in 2011 using a mathematical model. And they show that if the caesarean section rate continued to rise in the USA, as they have had in previous year to 2011, by 2020, so that's only 6 months ago, the rate would be 50%. Fortunately, this didn't happen. It's only 35%, 33 to 35% in the US. But if it goes to 50%, and that's a hint for countries like Egypt and Turkey, you would have an increase immediately in the numbers of placenta previa, placenta accreta spectrum, and of course, all the related maternal deaths to these 2 conditions, which can be associated with massive obstetric hemorrhage. And this is an example of a case in Cairo from my colleague, Professor Ahmed Hussain, who I'm closely working with at the moment on this topic. And you can see here the complete remodeling of the uterine wall in a patient who's had 5 caesarean section before, with the placenta being completely stuck here. And here you can see the placental tissue inside the myometrium. This is scar tissue, it's not normal muscle anymore. And you see the villi have managed to embed themselves. So they're impossible to detach unless you remove part of the uterus or the entire uterus. So that's the result of this increase. Now, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I've just found for this presentation these 2 papers on using stem cells to try to repair uterine scar. This is a rat model, which managed to show that using amniotic epithelial cells could regenerate a uterine scar. And here they've used umbilical cord cells, stem cells in the treatment of skin scar. Obviously, I'm much more interested in the cesarean scar model, although the patient might be more interested in her skin scar. This is really hope that we will manage to address this issue, and we won't continue to have this incredibly complicated case, which, included in the UK, are associated regularly with maternal death. So what about the rest? You know, this is the scar. Of course, this is a mechanical problem that we create. There's an abundant literature between 2000 and I will show you the latest one, showing that milk samples from mothers who had an elective cesarean section contain different bacterial microbiota. So immediately you can see the influence on the newborn microbiome. That you also influence the immune response in the newborn. There's also an association which may be linked to the microbiome with childhood obesity and type 1 diabetes. Of course, a lot of these studies do not take into account the fact that maternal obesity increases the risk of cesarean section, and therefore there might be a link between the need for a cesarean section and these complications. Also, there's a lot of literature showing a link between the use of antibiotics before delivery and the development of asthma and allergic disease. And these are published in general, especially recently, in very serious journals, in top journals in science, as you will see in this paper, which was published at the end of last year. This is a study in the UK where they have, and I'm sorry because it's a lunch hour lecture, they have studied feces samples from newborn at full term and 6 to 9 months after birth, and those who were born by cesarean section had their microbiome disrupted by the transmission of less maternal bacterial strains, but by contrast, a high level of colonization by opportunistic pathogen, mainly those that you find in hospital environment, which is obviously where the cesarean sections are being done. Now, you also have a similar effect for vaginal delivery if you have used antibiotics before delivery, and in babies who are not breastfed during the neonatal period. So this raises some important question, and certainly will deserve more research in the future. These are important components of the fetal matrix and life after birth. So we were supposed to be in the Darwin Theatre. I think that maybe it's better that we do this, virtually, because Darwin may be turning in his grave now with what we have done to our unnatural evolution. I'm not sure the survival of the fittest works anymore with the epigenetic effect of black carbon, microplastic, mercury, Tabasco, noise antibiotic, etc., that we are exposing our fetuses to. And this is a very nice poster from the Future organization, which states that when you are pregnant, you're also pregnant with your grandchild. I hope that politicians who are going to be involved in the next conference in the UK on climate change will not only consider, and of course this is extremely important, our children and the wildlife, which is essential to the survival of this planet, but also the unborn generation. And I really think that it is time to make these politicians aware that if they're not too concerned about climate changes, or they just pretend they are, but they are not doing anything really active about it, they should think about their grandchildren and all the generation that will follow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Eric, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. Absolutely fascinating, putting human reproduction into the current stage and how it influences the development of our children and our grandchildren. We've got some questions, specifically actually about caesarean sections. But before we go on, I just want to remind all viewers to use the Slido website to post questions, and then I can challenge Eric with them. So the first one's from Tobias. Eric, a very general question. What do you think is the cause of the rise of caesarean section rates globally?
Obviously, there are these factors, which is, maternal age, which has an impact. The average age of giving birth when I started at UCH was 24, and now it's 31. So certainly we have more and more women over the age of 40 giving birth, and whatever you do, the risk of caesarean section is around 50% when you're over 40, which doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but obviously you have to be prepared for the fact that, I tell the patient, yes, I would love to run the marathon and win it, but no competition,
Yeah.
when it comes to competing with, a 22-year-old who has been doing this and is extremely fit.
In fact, there's a sort of follow-up question, Eric, about how can we start to reverse the current upward caesarean section rate trend globally? And would this be a good thing?
I've been trying hard with my colleagues in Egypt, which I'm going there regularly until the pandemic, and they have been trying at the national level, including in football stadiums. Maybe they could hire Mo Salah, their celebrity footballers, to make a speech, but it has become a trend and it has become a fashion, and Egypt is low to medium income countries. But as soon as people have money, they want to have the same delivery as their friends. So I've been talking to women whose husband had been promoted, who now had the means to have a caesarean section. It's not very expensive, of course, for our standards. It's something like $500 to $1,000 in Egypt privately. But they want to have it because even if they've had a few normal deliveries before, their friend had a caesarean section, so they want to have one as well. So, we're talking to women who've had sometimes 4 normal deliveries.
Yeah.
Fashion.
Yeah. Okay.
So how do you reverse that?
Well, yes. What about sort of you need fashion leaders to buck the trend, I guess, don't you?
But fashion leaders are opting for caesarean section or surrogate.
I know. That's the problem.
They don't want to do it themselves.
Yeah. And also a question following up again, do caesarean sections increase the rate of childhood obesity and I guess therefore adult obesity, or is that just a correlation with more obese women having caesarean sections?
Yes, I did put that in my slide, and obviously a lot of these studies are biased because they don't take into account this type of confounders and the fact that the mothers may not be very healthy, maybe smoking, it's too big to push, if you want, rather too posh to push.
Yeah.
It's also something that we need to address and help these women before they get pregnant. There's a pre-conception counseling, I think, is increasingly important in this context. And this is also a platform that could help discussing the delivery rather than waiting for the last minute after they've been bombarded with adverts on the internet and fake news.
And in fact, Eric, if I might just press you on this, that although we're getting more obese over time, is it true that our skeleton is becoming more android? Is the mother's pelvis less amenable to a vaginal birth? And if she was obese, having a big baby, then maybe the caesareans are unnecessary.
I mean, from the literature I read on this, and it's mainly coming from anthropologists, this all happens when we started becoming, when we settled and became farmers, because the way we bend to cultivate the ground has in a way modified our pelvis. But you also have genetic evidence showing that it only mutates once every 3,000 years. But no, it's not because you have a big size that you have a big pelvis. You probably have the same pelvis as anybody else. So your BMI is not directly related to your pelvis, which is not directly related to your BMI. And of course, the weight of your fetus is going to be related to your BMI, diabetes, etc. Your fitness is going to be related to your BMI. And all these are important components in trying to decrease caesarean sections.
Okay, great, thank you. Some other interesting questions here. What is the safest method of induction of labor in women with previous sections, 1 or 2?
Do as little as possible. Just wait for things to happen. Don't let them go too much over 40 weeks. If possible, just break the waters around 40 weeks, 39, 40 weeks. It all depends on the reason of the previous design section. If you had someone who had, 3 days labor, who never dilated, and had a baby that was, 7, 8 pounds, and the next pregnancy the baby is 9 pounds at term, I think you're really taking a risk for nothing, because you obviously have evidence that it didn't work the first time, and then you have the scar risk, plus the fact that the second baby tends to be a little bit bigger than the first one. So I think reducing cesarean section shouldn't be based on increasing the number of VBAC, or vaginal births after cesarean section. We shouldn't push women into having a VBAC when they've had a complicated first delivery. What we need to do is to decrease the first cesarean section.
Yeah. Okay, slight change of subject here. What are your thoughts, opinion on vaginal seeding practices as a probiotic measure for the newborn?
Oh, wow, that one, you need to speak to the pediatrician about that. Yeah. When you think that in many places they don't screen for strep B, group strep B, streptococcus B. I mean, do you really want to put this in the mouth of your baby? I mean, this is complete nonsense. This is the only time when Nature behaved like a tabloid, when they published that paper, which I use in some of my presentations. It's based on 3 cases. And of course, they try to screen them for absolutely everything that, could be a pathogen to the fetus. I mean, it makes no sense to me. I think breastfeeding is probably a much better one, because if you want to give your babies microbiome, we should help women who have had cesarean section to breastfeed, because you have your skin microbiome, which is as good as probably better in terms of the nasty bacteria you can find inside your body.
Yeah. So that's a no then on that one.
No, this is absolute madness. I mean, there's not me saying this. You just the Royal College of Pediatricians. We were up in arms when they started.
Yeah,
they're trying to convince women to do this.
Thank you, Eric. So sometimes women having elective cesarean sections request vaginal seeding for the neonate to improve gut microbiome. What's your advice? I think no. Is that?
Yeah.
Is it confirmed that the placenta has a microbiome? It's another question.
Also a good question. Yes, there were studies showing that you have, PCR amplifying part of the genomes of some bacteria inside the placenta. I've only seen one paper. I haven't seen any confirmation of that. Theoretically, the amniotic fluid is completely sterile. Of course, you can have infection with parasites and bacteria, Listeria being a common one, and toxoplasmosis, which is another well-known one. But naturally, the normal bacteria of your digestive system, which is where 80% of your microbiome is, and which probably regulates your entire immune system, do not seem to cross that easily. Yeah. Maybe bits of it. Yeah. Certainly immunoglobulins.
Thank you. So Eric, here's a question from our leader, Anna David. How worried are you about the risks of air pollution and the effect on the fetus and placenta? And do you think it's time for doctors to warn women about this risk?
I think we need to take this to the next level. And this is what Public Health England is doing at the moment. And I'm involved as an advisor to that group, is for the politician to support the women. Maybe in the construction industry by providing better filtration, because you're not going to be able to move women. If you give them advice about pollution because they live next to King's Cross, they might not be able to move to the countryside for their pregnancy. So what we need to do is to implement, national policies for polluted area to prevent exposure to pollution, because you can actually filter the air that comes into your house through air conditioning, for example, by improving the filtering system. And that's certainly something that, I hope the politician will take on board when we present the report to them at the end of the year.
Great. Eric, it looks like there aren't any more questions on the Slido. We've got, one more has just popped up. Nice question, actually. Does high altitude and low oxygen tension affect placental development?
Yes, it does. I mean, I would refer to some of the papers I've been involved in. And, you know, that's probably not really the ideal platform to discuss that. And I'm happy to discuss this with that person individually if they want to send me an email, because it's too complex to discuss the, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it's an environment, and yes, it's interesting from that point of view that, you know, when the Chinese started to colonize Tibet, you know, and it was the same with the Spaniards in South America, in Bolivia. They didn't have a successful pregnancy in Bolivia for 150 years. It's only when they started mixing with the local population that is starting having successful pregnancy. So it's either miscarriage or stillborn or neonatal death. So it really does seem to have an effect.
And hypertension as well, wasn't it?
Hypertension as well, yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, we live in dangerous times. And I think we've just got to do something about the environment to help the species, not just us, but many others. Eric, that's been a fantastic talk, really broad-ranging and focusing on the way that our environment has, we've affected our environment, which is coming to bite us back and affect the way we reproduce. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone listening for that great talk.
Thank you very much, David.
And I want to mention to everyone actually the upcoming lectures, all on the UCL Minds webpage. Keep well, see you soon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to all the participants as well. Thank you very much for the question. They were very nice.